Hello everyone, this is part 2 of the Ediacaran biota. I have 4 questions for you. Please take a piece of paper and a pen and write them down. Number 1. What is a molecular clock? I may not explain this, so you might have to Google it. Number 2. What do molecular clocks tell us about when our ancestors, the earliest animals, emerged? Number 3. When did life become big? When did the first big creatures appear? In million years. And number 4, what are the names of the 4 assemblages of the Ediacaran biota? There's 4 distinct stages of how life evolved during the Ediacaran. They have 4 names. The first name is very long and very hard to remember. You will see. Let's start. You've seen this slide before. It is quite complex, so I will help you through it. Let's walk over here to the time chart, which goes from 875 to the beginning of the Cambrian. It shows the Tonian, Cryogenian, Ediacaran, and Cambrian periods. The line that you see here is the carbon isotopic composition of carbonates through time. And you may remember that I explained to you that this line that's wiggling up and down here tells us something about the carbon cycle. For example, sometimes values that are very high, like these ones here, tell us that a lot of biological productivity happened and that a lot of organic carbon was buried, while drops to negative values like these ones here indicate a disturbance of the entire carbon cycle, maybe a collapse of ecosystems, maybe the release of isotopically light carbon into the atmosphere, or any other mechanisms that we are not yet aware of. These ups and downs in the Neoproterozoic are extremely strong, 10 times bigger than the last 500 million years, and they tell us the carbon cycle went berserk, up and down and up and down and up and down. And the same ups and downs we see in the biosphere. Around 800 million years ago, we have these first complex eukaryotic creatures emerge. This seems to be Rhizarian, an early relative of Foraminifera. This is quite clearly a so-called test-hit amoebae. Out of this hole came little pseudopodia. These things were single-celled and microscopic, but relatively large already, and they were the first creatures producing scales and tests. They were protecting themselves against something, indicating that there was probably the first arms race happening between and among single-celled creatures. Probably no big creatures yet. These things try to eat each other. What is the earliest evidence then for animals? Well, I can tell you that in the Tonian and in the Cryogenian is certainly not a single fossil of an animal. But there's other types of evidence. And the best evidence that we have for very early animals comes from molecular clocks. So I told you fossils are rare and simple also in the Cryogenian. The oldest evidence for animals is indirect evidence. We don't see anything in the geological record, but we can do computations. We can take living creatures like animals and compare our DNA with the DNA of sponges and jellyfish and different types of worms and bivalve. And because if you have a strand of DNA with a CT, A, and G, the different base pairs, and we know what the rate of random exchange of these different mutations actually is. And so we can compare ourselves with jellyfish, see how different we are from jellyfish, and then compute back how many 100 million years would it have taken for us to distinguish ourselves from jellyfish and from sponges and so on. Go back in time to the last common ancestor of all living animals, and I explain this later exactly what that last common ancestor means. And these clocks then suggest that, look at here, we go from here over here, that the last common ancestor of all living creatures, of all animals, existed roughly around 800 million years ago. plus minus 200 million years, these computations are rough. And that creature was probably still extremely primitive and simple. What's the next piece of evidence? We have here biomarkers, molecules where people thought, wow, these things were only produced by sponges, giving evidence that sponges must have existed here by 635 million years ago and even into the Cryogenian. Now we know that that is probably actually not true. These molecules up there seem to be produced within the sediment through chemical transformations of sterols produced by algae, not by animals. So that evidence is gone. Then, at around 600 million years ago, we get the most fabulous fossils that ever been found. These things are microscopic. These were produced from clusters of soft cells that magically were phosphatized and survived. This, in fact, is the embryo, the first cluster of cells of an embryo of an animal. 600 million years old. What's the next evidence? Here already, at now important date, 575 million years ago, life got big. We have the first fossils that are up to 2 meters in size, and they just suddenly emerge, almost out of nowhere. Then we have another fossil. It is 560 million years old, and this seems to be the first track, the first trace of something relatively big, a few centimeters, millimeters maybe, moving through the sediment, leaving a trace. And that is followed by another milestone. Just before the pre-Cambrian-Cambrian boundary, we have the first things making hard shells, clearly protecting itself against something. I will show you another slide that summarizes the keystones of the evolution in this period of time. So this slide will follow us around for the next 30 minutes, and it will fill it in with bits and pieces of creatures. Here's the Cryogenian, here's 635, here's 541. There is 4 different so-called biotas, different assemblages of creatures that we can distinguish. Between 635, the end of Snowball 2, and the so-called gaseous glaciation, another huge glaciation, but not quite a snowball. In that period, the so-called Doshan-Toro Perta-Ta-Ta-Ka biota emerges. I promised you a difficult word. Those existed all the way through the Ediacaran, but they were the only creatures until 580 million years ago. Doshan-Toro is a formation in China, and the Perta-Ta-Ta-Ka formation is in central Australia. So remember, this is not the Perta-Ta-Ka, it is the Perta-Ta-Ta-Ka biota around Alice Springs. Then we have the so-called Avalon assemblage, the White Sea assemblage, and the Nama assemblage. Avalon is the peninsula in Newfoundland, where you find the Cryogenian Ediacaran boundary. We saw the rocks. The White Sea is in northwest Russia. And the Nama assemblage, Nama, is in Namibia, in Africa. So in the next slides, we're going to fill this slide in, and I'll show you what these creatures look like.